get underway with reference to introduction. We're not covering any text this evening. We'll make a reference to several texts, but I'm meaning we're not going to get into chapter 1. We do that next week. We're going to cover chapters 1 to 4. So I encourage you to get your Bible, particularly next week. We're going to be making some notes even tonight, but I encourage you to keep a Bible open, keep a pencil close by, because you may want to make a marginal note now and then, or make an introductory note at the introduction of the book of Isaiah. Every book of the Bible has introductory notes in my Bible, and it helps me in the future. I may remember Isaiah tonight, but 5 months from now, I may not remember the details about Isaiah when somebody asks. So I encourage you to make marginal notes in your Bible. Isaiah has been called the dean of the prophets, and that's pretty much a recognized concept with reference to Isaiah. J. Sidlow Baxter said this about Isaiah: as a writer, he transcends all his prophet compeers, that is, his contemporaries. And it is fitting that the matchless contribution from his pen should stand as leader to the 17 prophetical books. All who have any sense of literary appreciation must be impressed by the combined excellencies of Isaiah's style. Its grandeur, its dignity, its energy and liveliness, its profusion of imagery, its vividness of description, its forceful play on words, its dramatic and rhetorical touches, and last but not least, its wonderful variety. Well, he said quite a bit about the nature of the book of Isaiah, and I say amen. Isaiah has been called the Messianic prophet, and that's perhaps because he is quoted more in the New Testament than any other of the prophets. So he has been referred to as the Messianic prophet. We'll say more about the Messianic prophecies in a moment. Some have referred to him as the Paul of the Old Testament. And as we revere Paul, we revere Peter and James and all the other writers, but we revere Paul as this main character of writing. So is Isaiah viewed that way in reference to the Old Testament. Now, if you have the workbook and you want to follow along, I'm going to follow the same outline format that's in the workbook. So if you want to care to keep up there, if not, then the outline that's on your handout is the same points that are going to be here, so you can keep up with when you need to find the information and fill that out. Let's talk about the prophets and the prophetical books. This is going to be important to set the setting for the book of Isaiah. The book of Isaiah and the prophets, let's speak of the prophets as a whole for a moment, make up the fourth section of the Old Testament. Now, some of this is quite simplistic for some of you, but others of you, this is plowing new ground as to how the books are arranged. So I'm going to take the time to go through some of that. This is the Bible library as many view it, and I think this is how the Bible has been arranged. The Bible is arranged by subject matter, not chronology. We would like to think you just start in Genesis and read through and it's chronological. It's not. Not at all. It's arranged by subject matter. So you have the first 5 books called the law books or the Pentateuch. And then we have 12 history books from Joshua to Esther. And we mentioned repeatedly as we were studying the book of Esther, when we finished Esther, which we did a couple of weeks ago, we have finished Old Testament history. Now there's more to the Old Testament certainly, but we finished Old Testament history. Now you have a section of 5 books called poetry books or the wisdom literature of Job through Song of Solomon. And then the last section, the fourth section of the Old Testament, and the last section is 17 prophecy books. And so Isaiah begins the prophecy section of the Old Testament. Isaiah begins the section of the prophets, but he is also the first of the major prophets. So the first 5 books of the prophets are called major prophets, and the other 12 make up what we call the minor prophets. They're called major because of their size, not because of their importance or their impact. Some think that they're more important because they're bigger books. It's just because they're bigger books. That's why we call them the major prophets. It is generally thought that Isaiah is the largest of the books. It has 66 chapters. Jeremiah has 52, but actually Jeremiah is longer by number of verses and number of words. And so that's a bigger book. And then the book of Isaiah, though it looks like Isaiah may be a little bit bigger book, though it's not. So it begins this section, and it sets at the beginning of the major prophets. Now, the whole period of the prophets covers about 400 years. That is, when you take all of the prophets, that are recorded in these 17 books, it covers about 400 years, from about 800, these are approximate dates, not exact, to 400 BC. Now remember the intertestament period after the last prophet, Malachi, ceases. We have 400 years of silence before Christ. So that brings us down to 400 BC. Remember, BC dates go backwards. So 800 BC is before 400 BC. All right, that being the case, then we're about 400 years, around 800 BC to 400 BC is the time of the prophets as a whole. We're just talking about the prophets as a whole. Now, let's talk about the work of the prophets and the things that they dealt with. And there are 3 points we want to notice, and this will be on your handout if you want to fill that out, on the work of the prophets. This is true of every prophet. The work of the prophets was that they would deal with the prevailing conditions of the day, whatever they were. And that's why when we introduce a book, whether it be the book of Isaiah, and we'll talk about this tonight, or we get to Jeremiah, we get to Amos, or any other book, we'll talk about the political landscape. We'll talk about the economic landscape. We'll talk about various things, the spiritual condition. So they dealt with things like the moral condition, the social condition, the spiritual condition, and the political situation. Because even in the book of Isaiah, the political circumstance of Assyria being in power and the threat of Assyria, the threat of Syria, not Assyria, and Israel against Judah, we'll talk about those details in a moment. All of that political scenery is an important part of the book of Isaiah. The same thing is true concerning the moral decline. So they're going to deal with all of those kinds of things. So we see that in the prophets. Here's a second thing they will deal with. They preach this message that God rules over the nations. Now, if you've never studied the prophets before, and I think everyone here has, but let's just suppose this is their first study of a prophet ever, they probably will be surprised that the prophet deals with the nations. We have a tendency to think they're dealing with God's people constantly, and they did, but they did more than that. Nearly every prophet, not everyone, but nearly every prophet has a nations section. Isaiah chapters 13 through 23 is the nations section of the book of Isaiah. And we'll talk about why that, when we get to Isaiah 13 to 23, we'll talk about what's the point of that. Why does he deal with the nations? If he's writing this for the benefit of Judah, why does he mention what happens to Egypt? Why does that matter? We'll talk about the significance of that. But they talk about God ruling over the nations. Well, to stop just for a moment to get a practical point, the practical thing we're learning is God rules in the kingdoms of men. God constantly rules in the kingdoms of men. We'll see that in the book of Daniel a little bit later as we make our way to Daniel. Here's the third thing that you're going to see in the prophets, and that is hope for better days under or through the Messiah are foretold. Now, we won't get into this just at this point, and so I'm just wanting to plant a seed in your mind, and if you say, well, I'm a little confused, when we come back to this later in the book of Isaiah, then maybe this will come back and make sense. But there's often what we call the blending of prophecy, in that there is a prophecy that is going to be immediately or soon fulfilled, and then there's also a distant fulfillment. But sometimes they're blended together because in the prophet's mind, he doesn't necessarily see the difference because they didn't always understand the things they prophesied about, though they were speaking by inspiration. In other words, there may be something a long way off that to the prophet looks like it's going to be near. He doesn't understand whether it's a long way off or near, but he's speaking by inspiration. We'll give an illustration of that a little bit later. But here's a picture I want you to see concerning this, painting the picture of brighter days and better days through the Messiah. Quite often, before he gets to that point, and I'm not just talking about Isaiah, I'm just talking about prophets in general, before they get to the point about the Messiah, they will talk about the sin of the nation of Judah or Israel, as the case may be, the sin of the nations, plural, and then that as the background, as if as an artist had taken this canvas and painted a dark background, then growing out of that dark background is a brighter tomorrow, a brighter future. And so that's what the prophet's going to do. So when we get to the first few chapters, You're going to be seeing sin in Judah and terribleness in Judah. And you say, okay, what's the picture? He's painting this dark canvas, how terrible things are in Judah, how bad the leaders are. And growing out of that is going to come through the Messiah, a brighter day in the Messiah. So hopefully that makes some sense to us. We're going to see that. We'll stop several times through the prophet and say this is messianic. And you notice he just painted this dark background, and now he's painting the picture of the Messiah coming out of that. And we'll talk about that picture of the Messiah a little bit later. Remember those three things. We're going to see all three of these in the book of Isaiah. The prevailing conditions of the day. He's going to deal with sin. He's going to deal with God ruling in the nations and hope for a better tomorrow. Now, the prophets are classified. Often when we talk about a prophet, we classify them by date. We classify them, and so you may look up on the internet and say, I want to know when the prophets prophesied, and you can find all kinds of lists that here was the first prophet, and here was the last prophet, and here's the chronological order in which they supposedly prophesied. But that's not so much what I'm interested in here, though we'll do a little of that. They are classified by period and by the nation to whom they prophesied. So when I'm studying a prophet, when I open up, and maybe I'm not going to be teaching the prophet, I'm just going to preach a sermon, say from Amos. I may have to jog my memory. Okay, where did he fit? Was he in, what period did he fit in? The pre-exile, exile, or post-exile period? And which nation did he prophesy if he's in the pre-exile period? Was he prophesying to the north or to the south? Those are two questions I want to know first before I even start reading in the book. So I want to know the period. So let's talk about the period. We classify them by period or by chronology. By that I'm talking about pre-exile or post-exile prophets. Now, pre-exile prophets, this is not a complete list, but pre-exile prophets, for example, would include men like Isaiah, Hosea, Micah, and others. I'm not here for the purpose of giving an exhaustive list, but I'm just giving you a flavor of some pre-exile prophets. That is, they prophesied before Babylonian exile. And if they were in the northern kingdom, obviously before the northern kingdom went into Assyria. There were prophets who went into exile, and their work was during exile. They weren't over in Jerusalem, or they were not over in Samaria. They are in the midst of exile. Daniel is in exile. So is Ezekiel in exile. Those get exciting because they're after the nation has fallen. Both the north and the south have fallen. We have then the post-exile prophets. We touched on this briefly because we've been through the book of Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. They fit into that post-exile period. They've come back. This is the remnant has returned. And so there were prophets, and we talked in our study last time, at the time before, the last 2 weeks, we talked about Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, all fit into that post-exile period. All right, and we'll say more about that in a moment. But let's go to the nation to which they prophesied. There were some prophets that prophesied to the north, to Israel, Hosea and Amos, for example. And so Amos and Hosea were pre-exile prophets, and they prophesied to the nation of Israel, to the north. All right? There were prophets that went to the south. This is after the kingdom divided, obviously, and we'll get a map on that in a moment, a time frame. And there was Joel, Isaiah, fits right there, Micah, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah are all pre-exile prophets, but they were prophesying to the south, that is, to the nation of Judah. Then there were exile prophets, that they were off in Babylonian and later in Persian captivity. There were those who went to the remnant, and that is that when they came back, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So here's what we need to know for tonight, that Isaiah is a pre-exile prophet that prophesied to the southern kingdom of Judah. He's working in the south. He's not working in the north. He's working in the south. He's working in Judah, is where he is prophesying. Now, let's talk about the man Isaiah. We know a little bit about the prophets and the prophetical books and how we classify them. And the main thing I want you to walk away with is he is one of the major prophets because of size. And he is a prophet to the south, and he is in a pre-exile period. All right, let's talk about what we know about the man Isaiah. His name means salvation of Jehovah. Salvation of Jehovah. Now that's interesting because one of the major themes is put your trust in God and not in the nations, like Assyria, like Egypt. We'll see more about that in a moment. But put your trust in faith. Salvation is of Jehovah. That's an interesting name. Names were very significant in Bible times. What do we know about his family? Well, we know this about his family. Look at verse 1 of chapter 1. He is the son of Amoz, not Amos, S, Amoz with a Z. He is the son of Amoz, who was the brother of Amaziah. Now, we're going to make some sense of that in a moment, which would make him a first cousin of Uzziah and the grandson of King Joash. So now I just mentioned 4 people. And if you're filling out your fill in the blank, who was his father? It was Amoz. Amoz was his father. Who was his grandfather? His grandfather was Joash. And his uncle was Amaziah, and his cousin was Uzziah. And so here were kings that he was related to as a granddad, he had a granddad, an uncle, and a cousin who were kings in Judah, which means that he was of royal blood and a man of the palace. He was of royal blood and man of the palace. So his granddad, his uncle, and his cousin were kings. We'll point those kings out in a moment on a time scale. All right? That's what we know about those men in his family. Chapter 8, verse 3 mentions his wife was a prophetess. That was either because she was the wife of a prophet, and that's called a prophetess, some think so, or she may have had the gift of prophecy herself. Some think so. Which was it? I don't know. Don't know. I'm not really concerned about that. I'm more concerned about Isaiah, that his wife was called a prophetess. I would take it that she perhaps had some gift of prophecy, but she may have just been married to a prophet, and that's why she was called such. Chapter 8, verse 3 mentions his 2 sons. He has a son named Shir-Jasub. That's a mouthful, Shir-Jasub. And his name, Shir-Jasub, meant a remnant shall return. He talks about that in this book. The other son was named Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. Homer Haley says they don't name them like they used to. And he said, I always wanted to name a son Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz and call him Hash for short. Well, anyway, what does that name mean? That name simply means the spoil speedeth, the prey hasteth. Both names are significant to the tone and to the message of the book of Isaiah. All right. Now, that's what we know about his family. Isaiah wrote more than just the book of Isaiah. So let's turn over to 2 Chronicles, if you will, 26 and verse 22. And I just want to get just a touch of what's going on. 2 Chronicles 26 and verse 22, that the rest of the acts of Uzziah, from the first to the last, the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amoz, wrote. This tells me he wrote more than this book. That's all I'm wanting us to see. So he wrote about the life of Uzziah. That was his cousin. He wrote about that. All right? That's not all he wrote. Look over to the 32nd division, the same book, chapter 32 of 2 Chronicles, and in verse 32, that again the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and his goodness and the deeds are they not written in the vision of Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, and in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. So he wrote other historical accounts as well as the book of Isaiah. Tradition says he was sawn in two with a wooden saw at the command of King Manasseh. Do we know that for sure? No. But there's a couple of things to point out about that. Apparently, that concept comes from an apocryphal book called The Ascension of Isaiah. Now, if it's an apocryphal book, it means it was rejected as being inspired, not always rejected as being somewhat historical. So it could be true. It's not an inspired record, so I can't say I know that to be 100% true, but it is thought that to be the case. Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 37, I'm not going to take the time to turn there, but if you want to run over there and take a look, it doesn't mention Isaiah, but it talks about some being sawn asunder, sawn in two. And so maybe that has a reference, some think it does, to Isaiah. Tradition of the Talmud says it was because he resisted Manasseh's idolatrous decree that he then had him sawn in two with a wooden saw. A gruesome and terrible death. All right, let's talk now about the time and the date of his work. His work covered about 40 years, from 740. Now, this is going to be important. From 740, this is maybe something that you want to write down at the beginning of the book of Isaiah. And here's why, because later on, something come up. Well, where does Isaiah fit? And you look over and you've got it written down in the margin of your text, close to Isaiah 1 and verse 1. 740 to 700 BC. That's an approximate time, about 40 years, maybe as much as 50. And we'll tell you why maybe 50 in a moment. So he covered these kings. Now look at chapter 1 and verse 1. Chapter 1 of Isaiah and verse 1 says that the vision came to him in the days of Uzziah, Ahaz, and Jotham, and Ahaz and Hezekiah. So these first four are mentioned here, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. But we mention Manasseh because Manasseh, if our understanding of the possibility of Manasseh cutting him in two is true, then he would have gone into that day of the kings. So he covered 4 to 5 kings, 40 perhaps to 50 years. But we'll go with the 40 from 740 to 700 BC. Again, BC dates going backwards. Now this is a time scale that we have in nearly every classroom, and you see this many times, and it's because I'm impressed with this. I saw this probably 35 or 40 years ago, probably 40 years ago, and have got one on my wall. And it starts here with Adam and Eve and goes down through the time now of the judges. And then we go forward and we have right here the period of the United Kingdom. You have Saul and David and Solomon. And then the kingdom divides with the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Well, let's keep going now. We have the southern kingdom continuing on, and we have the northern kingdom continuing on. Then we come down here to Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, and you see Isaiah there. This is where we're fitting in. This is where Isaiah fits. Now, what I want you to notice is we've already got the dates approximately of about 740 to 700 BC. We have Manasseh down here who would have killed him, we think, perhaps. What I want you to notice is Assyria, during most of this time, Assyria up here, Assyria is the one in power during this time. This is the northern kingdom, but they go into Assyrian captivity. Assyria is the one in power. This captivity took place in 722 BC. Now take the 740 to 700, 722 is right in the middle of all of that. Make sense? Even though I'm lecturing and preaching, you can shake your head up and down. Does that make sense? That 722 is between 740 and 700. All right. So that's where that's going to fit. So Assyria is still in power. That's going to be an important thing as we go along. So then after him comes Jeremiah a little bit later, and then they go into captivity, and then you have Daniel, and then you have the other prophets. But he's way back here before Manasseh. So let's back up just a little bit. Where did he fit? He fits in the period of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Then after he's gone, if Manasseh killed him, then you have these other kings, then they go into captivity. Long before captivity. In fact, it's about 150 years. We'll come back to that here in just a second. This is Bible maps, diagram of the chronology of the prophets, just trying to get you a perspective of taking the prophets. Now we start about 900, 800, 700, 600, 500, 400 BC. If the last prophet was Malachi about 400 BC, then you have Isaiah right here. We have Isaiah right in here around the 740 to 700 BC. So what I want you to see is there were prophets like Elisha and Elijah before that, but then there were other prophets that came much after him, like Habakkuk and Micah and Jeremiah. They came, and Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi came much later than that. I'm just trying to get a perspective that Isaiah was one of the earlier prophets. That's all I'm trying to get before you. Now, quite often people ask about chronology. This is an effort, someone's effort to try to put the books in chronological order. Almost impossible. But for example, we start with Genesis. Job would fit back here. And Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy all fit together. Then you have Joshua, Judges. Then you have the period of the Kings over here, overlapped by 2nd Chronicles. And what I want you to see is following the Kings, you have this 70-year of exile, Babylonian captivity. After that, you have the post-exile period. Here's the point I'm trying to drive it from this. That here we have the period of the Kings. This is where the prophets fit in, is during the period of those kings. So it's not like you have the period of the kings. We got through with studying all of that. Now we need to study the period of the prophets. These prophets fit into the period of the kings. That's a point that's often lost in studying the prophets. Now, most of us know that, but sometimes we miss that point, and people get confused. Say, I thought we talked about that before. Yeah, we talked about this period before because we were studying the history. Now we're studying the prophets. It's like reading a book on the Civil War, and then maybe 2 years later you read a book on Abraham Lincoln. You think, I thought I already studied about that period. Yeah, now you're studying about the man that fits into that period. That's what you're doing. Same thing here. We're studying about a prophet that fits in and plugs in right here in Kings and Chronicles. That's where he fits in. Now, that would make him a contemporary with Micah. This is always interesting to me. Who would be a contemporary? Who would have been working along beside him? Micah prophesied from 735 to 700 BC. He was to the southern kingdom, but he was in the country while Isaiah seems to be in the city of Jerusalem. So while they're overlapping in time, they're not overlapping in work except doing the same kind of work. One is out in the country, and Isaiah seems to be right in the city of Jerusalem preaching and prophesying, while Micah is out elsewhere. There's some parallels. The prophecy of the birth of Christ, for example, is parallel in Isaiah and in Micah as well. Amos 740 to 750 was to the northern kingdom. Hosea went to the northern kingdom about 750 to 725 BC. So those were some contemporaries of Isaiah, would have worked along beside him. Now this is an approximate time frame to give you a picture. This was about 150, a little less, but we're just using that as a round number, about 150 years before the captivity. So he's a good ways before the captivity. It's not like it's about to take place and see it happen. Jeremiah lived to see it happen. So did Daniel see it happen. Ezekiel was right in the middle of it, but not Isaiah. He was dead and gone before that ever happened. Let's talk now about the background. The background to the book of Isaiah. This was a period of prosperity. And quite often, as is the case, prosperity brings on problems of spiritual and moral decline. Now let's get just a reference or two without turning there in interest of time. You remember Deuteronomy 6. You might make a note if you've got your workbook printed out or want to make a note somewhere. That Deuteronomy 6 had warned them when you get into the land, you're going to have it better than you've ever had it before. You're going to have vineyards you never planted, wells you didn't dig, et cetera, et cetera. You remember that. Then it said, beware lest you forget your God. If things go well for you, you might just forget your God. Proverbs 30 and verse 5, Proverbs chapter 30, verse 5 makes the same point. Prosperity often brings on moral and spiritual decay. And that it certainly did. In their pride, they forgot about their God. Idolatry and sin were rampant. Other prophets testified to the decay of the period. And so you want to know a little bit more than what you get out of Isaiah about how bad it was? Go read Amos. He's going to tell you how bad it was. Go read Hosea. He's going to tell you how bad it was. And they will paint this picture of whoredom, idolatry, and sin rampant through the nation. So that's kind of the background of what's going on. Now, let's talk about Assyria being the predominant nation and the threat. Assyria was the predominant nation and the threat. Now, before I get to that point, I want us to, if you're following in the workbook, you'll notice Amos gave a general warning. Let's turn over to the book of Amos, if you will. And I want you to notice in Amos, chapter 3, and in verse 11. Chapter 3, verse 11 says, an adversary shall be around the land. He's talking about Assyria. But what I want you to see is that Amos talked in general terms. An adversary is coming. That's all I want you to see. Look at chapter 6, Amos, verse 14. That a nation will rise up against you. That's Assyria. But he doesn't mention Assyria by name. But what I want you to see now is that Hosea, who was a contemporary, he was more specific. And so if you look over at Hosea and look at chapter 9, and let's just take a sampling of some of these. Look at chapter 9 and in verse 3. Chapter 9 and verse 3, that he mentions Assyria by name, that they shall eat unclean things in Assyria. So Hosea specifically identifies the threat as being Assyria. Chapter 10 and in verse 6, he mentions Assyria. Chapter 11 and verse 5 and verse 11. Chapter 14 and verse 3. These are passages that identify Assyria by name as being the predominant nation and the major threat. About 750 BC, about 10 years before Isaiah really gets to rolling with his prophecy and gets into his work, Assyria emerged as this great worldwide empire. They tried to control all the nations around them, including Israel and Judah. So this is part of the political scene. And this has everything to do with the message of the book. You say, what? I don't need to know about the political scene. Yes, you do if you're going to understand this book. We need to understand what Assyria was doing and what they did in reaction to Assyria. So they're trying to attack Israel and Judah. Henry Halley, that's not Homer Haley, that's Henry Halley in Halley's Bible Handbook. Isaiah's whole life was spent under the shadow of the threatening Assyrian power. And he himself witnessed the ruin of his entire nation at their hands except for Jerusalem. He lived his whole life, his whole prophecy, his whole work was done under the threat of this Assyrian power. So let's talk about two themes about the threat of Assyria. One is, let's talk about Assyria's relationship to Israel. What happened with Israel? Well, Assyria besieged Samaria, the capital of Israel, for 3 years. And then in 722 BC, they took them captive. And so now we have Assyrian captivity because they were the predominant power. Some 27,900 deportees were taken from Samaria to the upper Euphrates. And so they were taken captive. All right. So the northern kingdom of Israel is gone. Now, let's talk about Assyria's relationship to Judah. This is important because you're going to see phrases again and again, and I'm going to tell you that that has to do with this Assyrian threat. You say, what Assyrian threat? Pay attention. This is the threat. Assyria threatened Judah as well. They're coming after Judah after they've taken Israel. Syria, not Assyria, the nation of Syria and Israel, before they fell, wanted to form a coalition to fight against Assyria. We want to ward them off, and let's band together and fight, and we need Judah to fight with us. So, Ahaz, who was the king at the time, refused. 2 Kings 16, 2 Chronicles 28 is a record of that. See, it meshes with the Old Testament history. So Ahaz said, no, I'm not going to fight Assyria with you. So Syria and Israel came and had a war against Judah to try to force Ahaz to join in with them. You are going to fight with us, and we're going to force the fight. You're going to fight with us. So what does Ahaz do? He turns to Assyria for help rather than turning to the Lord. Now you're beginning to see something. They're putting their trust in men rather than in God. So Judah is turning to Assyria, the very enemy they're wanting to fight off. You help me fight against my own brother or in the nations. You help me fight against Israel. You help me fight against Syria because they're fighting me. All right, that's one time they're putting their confidence and trust in a nation rather than in God. Assyria later comes around. That didn't work, by the way. And later they come around and attack Judah. And this time Judah turns to Egypt for help. And so you'll hear me talk about the Egyptian party, those who thought we ought to go to Egypt for help. All right? That means they're putting their confidence in Egypt and not in God. So all through the book of Isaiah, the message is going to be put your trust and your confidence in God. Now, this is a little map of Assyria. We'll talk about Syria several times. The darker color here is early Assyria before they became the dominant empire. This lighter shaded area, including this darker shaded area, is the empire of Assyria. They became the worldwide empire. And they're wanting Israel and Judah under their control, and they attacked Judah and Israel. How are we going to ward them off? By seeking help from Assyria itself or seeking help from Egypt? And so the thought wasn't, let's go to God and let's put our trust and our confidence in God. Now, he was a prophet to the southern kingdom. We're going to say very little about this. We've already talked about this. Loophole says, in Isaiah we see for the first time a prophet appearing in the southern kingdom. And so were there prophets before? There is no doubt there were prophets before, but this is the first time we're seeing one in the southern kingdom prophesying and telling them of their sin, and it's at a late date, 150 years before they go into captivity. But be that as it may, he was a prophet to the southern kingdom. And so you have northern kingdom of Israel, and then this lighter shaded area here is Judah, and that's where he was working, particularly in the city of Jerusalem. Now let's focus on the message of the book. What is the message and the point of the book? H.C. Loophole says it's Yahweh's sovereignty. Well, there's two major thoughts, and this is part of filling out your sheet if you want to. Chapters 1 to 39 deals with chastening. It deals with Judah's sin and the impending Assyrian invasion. Assyria is our threat, and y'all are guilty of sin. It's a chastening. Chapters 40 to 66 is consolation, the encouragement to the captives who will return. They're not even in the post-exile period yet. But by the way, it's in this section where he talks about the return and mentions Cyrus by name, chapters 44 and 45. That Cyrus, the Persian, saw and read and decided it was time for him to return, let them return. Now here's something you want to mark, chapter 31, verse 1. In my mind, this is a summary verse of the message of the book. If someone said, pick out a verse that you think summarizes the entire book, it's this. Woe to those who go to Egypt. Remember I talked about turning to Egypt? For help. And rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they're very strong, but who do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek the Lord. Woe to those who put their confidence in Egypt instead of putting their confidence in God. And if you get that message, when you get through with the book of Isaiah, you've understood what Isaiah was preaching for about 40 years. Mark chapter 31 and verse 1. Now, this book is heavily messianic. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, in light of the failure, Haley says, on the part of the kings who rule over God's people, Isaiah announces that the Lord will raise up a king who will rule in righteousness. Their kings didn't, but this king will. This becomes a major theme of Isaiah. Robinson calls the book of, this is the book of Romans in the Old Testament because it deals with faith and trust in God. Now, we're going to do, not tonight, but as we go through the book, I'm going to try to draw attention to, this is a messianic section. So whether you want to highlight that or you want to mark it with a certain color pen or whatever, bring whatever you need, because we're going to try to mark those messianic sections so that you can come back later and just thumb through the book of Isaiah and say, here's a messianic prophecy, here's a messianic prophecy, and here's another one. So we're going to try to call attention to those prophecies as we go along. We're going to mark those and note those. This outline you'll see time and again. It's in your book. You'll see it again, so don't try to copy down every word of it. Just want you to get the message. What's the book saying? There's two major thoughts. There's the judgment from God, the Assyrian period, conflict and victory. Then there is this comfort from God, the hope for troublesome times, and the remnant returns. So we're going to start on the note of the prophecy against Judah and Jerusalem. Then there's the nation section. But here is the judgment from God, first of all, during that Assyrian period, and then here's the comfort from God. The tone changes completely in chapter 40. In chapter 40. So much so that you may think it's a different author, and so some have thought. And we'll come to that here in a second. Hopefully we'll have time to deal with that. Let's talk about Isaiah in the New Testament. He's quoted more than any other prophet. He's quoted more than any other prophet, some 213 times. I'm not sure that's an exact, accurate count, but that gives you an idea. Maybe it was 212, maybe it was 214, maybe it was 211. I don't know. I don't care. I just know it was more than any other prophet. So he's quoted more than any other prophet, over 200 times, we can safely say. All four Gospels introduce John the Baptist with a quotation from Isaiah chapter 40. And he gives us then this vivid picture of our Messiah. It is generally conceded that Isaiah presented the most vivid picture of the Messiah and his kingdom of any of the prophets. And so what kind of things does he talk about? This is not an exhaustive list. He tells us of his birth, that he had a forerunner, he would be anointed by the Spirit, that he would be a servant, that he'd be rejected by men, he'd be a stone of stumbling, he'd be a savior to the Gentiles, he would suffer and he would die, and he would be raised from the dead. That's just the beginning of the list. He says more about the Messiah than any other prophet. So it's going to be exciting to see his picture of the Messiah before the Messiah ever came. Now this is probably all as far as we're going to get, so let's talk about the unity of Isaiah. If you do any study on introductory information about Isaiah, you're going to come across the question of how many authors of the book. Some claim there were two writers because, as I just mentioned, there seems to be a shift between chapter 39 and 40 in the rest of the book. And the tone changes. And some think those were two different authors and Isaiah did not write them all. But let's turn to John 12 quickly. We've got time to do this. John chapter 12. This pretty much settles the question. John 12, beginning at verse 37. Notice that verse 38 says that the word of Isaiah, the prophet, might be fulfilled. He spoke, and now he quotes from Isaiah 53. And then, that's in the last section. That's in chapter 40 to 66. Then he turns around and says, Isaiah said again, and he quotes from Isaiah 6. That's in the first section. So he quotes from both sections and said, Isaiah said, Isaiah said. That pretty much settles it for me when the Lord said Isaiah wrote this part and Isaiah wrote that part. Let's add to the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls complete the book. There is a scroll of Isaiah where there is no break between chapter 39 and chapter 40. And so those evidences point very strong to the fact there is one author. Jesus said it was Isaiah, and that he must have written the entire book. Well, here's what we've seen about Isaiah. And we didn't get to the questions. I wasn't going to ask them out loud, but I was going to go over them. And if you had one that we didn't fill out, we would fill those out. But hopefully that helps you as a flavor of where we're going. We're going to look at chapters 1 to 4. Read the text, whether you look at the workbook or not, read the text, chapters 1 to 4. And then we'll make our way through those 4 chapters.